Morning. Welcome to the House Armed Services Committee hearing on the Department of Defense's Efficiency Initiative. We have with us three distinguished witnesses: Deputy Secretary of Defense William J. Lynn III, the Department's Chief Management Officer Dr. Ashton Carter, Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and General James E. Cartwright, United States Marine Corps, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The topic they're here to discuss is one of the most important we'll consider this year, and will be particularly important next year when the committee reviews President's budget request for fiscal year 2012. The topic is the Department's effort to wring billions of dollars of efficiency out of its operations. Let me begin and end this hearing with one clear overriding message. And I think I speak for the overwhelming majority of our committee, regardless of party, when I tell you I do not support cutting the defense budget at this time. The national security challenges this nation faces around the world dictate that we maintain the recent growth of our ground forces, the Army and Marine Corps, we modernize our Air Force, and that we grow our Navy. To do this, we must continue to grow the base defense budget for some time to come. I think I also speak for the committee by saying that we all want to eliminate waste within the department wherever and whenever we find it. And I commend the Secretary of Defense and his able support team, well represented here today, for making hard choices that have too often been avoided. Now, as you all know, this committee hasn't agreed on every decision made, nor should we. But we do respect the leadership being demonstrated by the Department of Defense. The Department's Efficiency Initiative is the most comprehensive effort of its kind in almost 20 years. Across the board, the committee stands ready to hear the Department's case. In the area of acquisition reform, we believe the Department's initiatives are very much aligned with policies this committee has advocated for years and which were recently clearly expressed in the report of our panel on defense acquisition reform. In other areas, we look forward to better understanding what the Department's proposing and what savings will be achieved. When it comes to jointness, insourcing, and information technology, this committee has long-standing interests and concerns that may not align as clearly with the Department's proposals. As long as I've served in Congress, the system has worked one way. The administration proposes, and the Congress disposes. This year and next will be no different. So, gentlemen, your task today is to persuade us that the initiative is not part of an agenda to cut the defense budget, and that it is consistent with this committee's longstanding priorities in a number of critical areas. Now I turn to my friend, my colleague, gentleman from California, Buck McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Lynn, Secretary Carter, General Cartwright, good morning and welcome to each of you. We've been looking forward to your testimony on the Department's Deficiencies Initiative for some time. I hope that you'll be able to provide members of this committee with detailed information regarding the Secretary's proposed measures and to allay the concerns that many of us share. As elected officials, members of Congress have a responsibility to ensure U.S. taxpayer dollars are not wasted on inefficient, wasteful, or redundant programs. I agree with Secretary Gates. We must scrutinize defense programs to ensure that we're generating the most bang for the buck and that we must concentrate our limited resources on the highest priority programs. Furthermore, I view it as the responsibility of the Armed Services Committee to exercise the same discipline on an annual basis through our Defense Authorization Act to shift funds from poorly performing programs to higher national security priorities and promising technologies for the future, such as missile defense and means to counter anti-access threats. But as with most things, the devil is in the details. Unfortunately, although we have requested more information, both verbally and in writing, the Department has failed to fully respond. My first concern is where we find $20 billion a year in cuts in the midst of two wars without also cutting back on required weapons and services needed to meet the threats of today and tomorrow. Secretary Lynn, you've already announced that at least a third of the savings will come from within the force structure and modernization accounts, the same accounts the Secretary is attempting to grow. We've seen that setting arbitrary targets for cost savings, as appears to have happened with insourcing, can frequently not yield the expected results. How do we avoid those pitfalls here? Second, I'm extremely concerned that no matter what the intentions of the Secretary may be, the administration and some in Congress will not allow the Secretary to keep the savings. This summer, the White House supported a teacher bailout bill that was funded in part with defense dollars. Once these savings from this efficiencies initiative are identified, what's to stop them from taking this money also? We're already seeing impacts of this summer's cuts. For example, some of those funds were intended to rectify an overdraft in the Navy's military pay accounts. Once those funds were taken, the Navy was forced to take the money from aircraft procurement accounts. What's the result? It's going to take longer to buy the external fuel tanks our Super Hornets and Growlers need, and to upgrade training simulators. Even worse, it will cost the taxpayers more money to buy those fuel tanks because we won't be able to take advantage of a negotiated bulk buy. So much for efficiency. Secretary Gates appears to share my concern. In August, he stated, and I quote, "My greatest fear is that in economic tough times that people will see the defense budget as the place to solve the nation's deficit problems, to find money for other parts of the government. I think that would be disastrous in the world environment we see today and what we're likely to see in the years to come," end quote. Third, with respect to acquisition reforms, most of these appear to be consistent with congressional direction. I would like to learn more about the Department's plans to set cost targets for new weapon systems. Congress supports analytical trade-offs between required capabilities, time to the warfighter, and cost. However, our requirements must be determined by the future threat environment, not simply by our budgets. The Department will have to convince members of this committee that these efforts will not weaken our nation's defense. To that end, we must fully understand the rationale behind each decision and potential impact of every cut. Case in point, who within the Department of Defense will be responsible for ensuring our commanders in Afghanistan and Iraq have the correct number and mix of military forces if the Department eliminates the Joint Forces Command? Thank you for your willingness to provide this committee with the information we require to conduct thorough oversight and support the Secretary's efforts to grow our investment accounts. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Secretary Lynn, you're on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and present testimony and discuss the Department's efficiency efforts. What I'd like to do, if it's acceptable, Mr. Chairman, is enter my complete statement into the record and summarize it briefly for you.
You may without an objection.
During his speech in May of this year at the Eisenhower Library, Secretary Gates outlined how in order to maintain and modernize America's key military capabilities at a time of war and fiscal pressure, the Defense Department would need to fundamentally change the way it does business. The reason is this: to sustain the current military force structure, which we must do given the security challenges the country faces, requires the equivalent of real budget growth of 2 to 3%. The overall defense budget, however, is projected to rise in real terms by about 1%. And the Department cannot and should not ask Congress or the American taxpayers for more increases unless and until we have done everything possible to make the dollars we already have count for more. Bridging the gap requires culling the Department's massive overhead cost and structure, the tail, and directing them to our fighting forces and modernization accounts, the tooth. This is not an effort to reduce the defense budget. This is about shifting resources and priorities within the existing top line. That requires reducing the Department's overhead costs by targeting unnecessary excess and duplication in the defense enterprise. This effort, moreover, is not just about the budget. it is also about operational agility. We need to ensure that the Department is operating as efficiently and effectively as possible. The Secretary has directed us to take a hard look at how the Department is organized, staffed, and operated, how we can flatten and streamline the organization, how we can reduce executive or flag officer billets and the staff apparatus that supports them, how we can shed overlapping commands and organizations, and how we can reduce the role and number of contractors. Since the Secretary's speech in May, DOD has embarked on a four-track approach toward a more effective, efficient, and cost-conscious way of doing business. I'll briefly touch on our activities in track 1 through 3 and then spend a little bit more time on track 4. On track 1, the Secretary directed that the military services find more than $100 billion in overhead savings over the next 5 years. The services, however, will be able to keep any of the savings they generate to invest in higher priority warfighting and modernization needs. This effort is underway now, and we have already begun to review the service's submissions. The fiscal 2012 budget will reflect the results when it is submitted to Congress in February. On track 2, the Department is seeking ideas, suggestions, and proposals regarding efficiencies from outside normal channels. We have solicited input from experts, from think tanks, from industry, and from the Department's external boards. We've also established a DOD suggestion program to solicit our employees' ideas. The Department is willing to consider any reasonable suggestion to reduce our overhead. With regard to track 3, the Department is conducting a broad review of how it is organized and operated in order to inform the President's 2012 budget submission. This track 3 review focuses on effecting long-term systemic improvements in several key areas of DOD operations. Dr. Carter will address those in more detail in his opening statement. With regard to track 4, which was announced on August 9th, we are addressing several specific areas where the Department can take action now to reduce inefficiencies and overhead. These steps are intended to jumpstart the reform process ahead of and separate from the normal programming and budgeting cycle. In particular, they represent the Secretary's lead effort to reduce headquarters and support bureaucracies, military and civilian alike, that have swelled to cumbersome proportions, grown over-reliant on contractors, and become accustomed to operating with little consideration of costs. Though all of these efforts will result in measurable savings, an equally important purpose is to instill a culture of cost consciousness and restraint in the Department, a culture that sets priorities, makes real trade-offs, and separates unrestrained appetites from genuine requirements. There are 8 major initiatives that reduce support contractors, headquarters personnel, senior executives, and flag and general officers. They also include efforts to reduce boards and commissions and to eliminate redundant intelligence organizations. Finally, track 4 involves several organizational disestablishment. The last decade has seen a growth of new offices and organizations, including 2 new combatant commands and 5 new defense agencies. The Secretary concluded that the Joint Forces Command, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Networks and Information Integration, the Joint Staff's J6 Directorate, and the Defense Business Transformation Agency no longer effectively satisfy the purposes for which they were created. Some missions and tasks that each perform remain vital, but can be managed effectively elsewhere. Other functions that each perform are either already performed elsewhere or are no longer relevant for the operation of the Department. We are mindful that the recommended actions will have economic consequences for displaced employees, their families, and their communities. The Department is committed to work with the affected communities and will devote significant attention to the challenges employees face during this time of transition. We have asked Dr. Clifford Stanley, the Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness, to take direct responsibility for this aspect of the Department's planning in order to ensure we take the steps necessary to help impacted employees with appropriate assistance and support. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I understand that some of these reforms may be controversial and unwelcome to some people, both inside and outside the Department. No doubt, many of these changes will be stressful, indeed wrenching, for the organizations and employees affected. But I would ask the members of this committee and the Congress as a whole to consider this reform agenda in terms of our responsibilities as leaders to set priorities and move resources from where they are needed least to where they belong. America's fighting forces, the investment in future capabilities to support those forces, and most importantly, the needs of our men and women in uniform. This is what Secretary Gates and President Obama are proposing, and we urge your strong support. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this initiative, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Before I call on Secretary Carter, I ask unanimous consent that Representative Conley sit with us at our hearing and ask questions after all members of the committee have had their chance to ask questions. And I ask the same of Mr. Scott, Bobby Scott from the great state of Commonwealth of Virginia for the same. So I ask unanimous consent for both Mr. Conley and Mr. Scott. Without objection, so voted. Secretary Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McKeon, distinguished members of the committee. I also thank you for the opportunity to join Deputy Secretary Lynn, General Cartwright, today to discuss Secretary Gates' efficiency initiative, and in particular, one piece of it for which I have responsibility. As part of his broad initiative to improve the American taxpayer's return on our investment in national defense, Secretary Gates and Deputy Secretary Lynn tasked me to improve the department's buying power, the way we acquire critical goods and services. And specifically, the portion of the budget that I'm addressing is that $400 billion of the $700 billion, which is contracted out for goods and services. The other $300 billion, just to remind you, we spend within the walls, so to speak, of the Department of Defense on the uniformed and civilian employees, their salaries, their benefits, and so forth, and the buildings and installations within which we work. That's 300 of the 700 billion. The other 400 billion is spent outside the walls, so to speak, of the institution on contracted goods and services. That 400 billion, in turn, about equally divided between the procurement of goods and the procurement of services. We estimate that by targeting efficiencies in both of these areas, we can make a significant contribution towards achieving the $100 billion redirection of defense budget dollars from unproductive to productive purposes sought by Secretary Gates and Deputy Secretary Lynn over the next 5 years, a significant contribution. The Department can only meet this goal, however, if we fundamentally change the way we do business. To put it bluntly, we cannot support our troops with the capabilities they need unless we do so. Our challenge is to sustain a military at war, take care of our troops and their families, and invest in new capabilities, all in an era when defense budgets will not be growing as rapidly as they were in the years following 9/11. Last year, we identified savings in the defense budget by canceling unneeded programs that weren't performing, that we had enough of, or whose time had passed. We'll still need to do that. But now we must find savings within programs and activities we do need and do want. The Department must achieve what economists call productivity growth. We must learn, as the way I've put it, to do more without more. Productivity growth you see in the commercial economy when you go and you buy a computer this year and it's a little bit better than last year's and maybe even a little bit cheaper. And yet we're too often in the position of coming to you every year with exactly the same product and explaining why it costs more this year than it did last year. And we'd like to see some of that productivity growth that we see elsewhere in the economy within the defense economy. On June 28th, I laid out a mandate to the defense acquisition workforce and the defense industry describing how the department could try to achieve better buying power. On September 14th, after months of work with the department's senior acquisition professionals, industry leaders, and outside experts, I issued specific guidance on how to implement that mandate. I'd like to submit, Mr. Chairman, both the June 28th mandate and the September 14th guidance and the charts which accompany them for the record.
Without objection.
We're now in implementation mode, taking each of the 23 principal items in that plan and putting them into practice, the very same teams that compiled them. The September 14th guidance contains 23 principal actions to improve efficiency, organized in 5 major areas, and I'd like to just highlight a few of the actions we're taking in each of these areas and give some illustrative examples. And Mr. Chairman, to address the point you raised in your opening statement, I think you'll see that many of the specific actions we're taking were, in fact, are not only consistent with, but some were inspired by the work of the subcommittee of this committee that deals with acquisition reform, so I think you'll find a lot of consistency there. First, as we begin new programs like the Ohio-class SSBNX replacement, the Joint Family of Systems for Long-Range Strike, the Army's Ground Combat Vehicle, and even a new presidential helicopter, we will be establishing affordability requirements that have the same force as high-priority performance requirements like speed, firepower, or bit rate. And Congressman McKeon, to your point, the objective is to have the design trades to which you referred be those which identify the key design parameters and then be able to plot how the cost of the system varies as those parameters are varied, not in order to have less military capability, but to understand where we can change the design in the direction of affordability without, in fact, compromising important military capability. That's the purpose of doing those design trades, and that's a discipline we need to have, and we haven't had enough of. We'll also insist that our acquisition professionals and suppliers plan according to what programs should cost, not according to self-fulfilling historical estimates of what they will cost, as if nothing can be changed in how we do business. We are already using this method to drive down costs in the Joint Strike Fighter program, the department's largest, and the backbone of tactical air power for the U.S. and many other countries. Second, to incentivize productivity and innovation in industry, we will strengthen the connection between profit and performance in our business practices. Among other things, we're exploring ways through contracting and financing vehicles and a pilot superior supplier incentive program to reward contractors who control their costs and demonstrate exemplary performance. Third, we will remove obstacles to effective competition. Last year, the Pentagon awarded $55 billion in contracts that were supposed to be competitive, but for which only one bid was received, usually from an incumbent. Yet simple changes in how we structure evaluations and work with industry have been shown to reduce by 50% the incidence of single bids by incumbents. Additionally, we will promote real competition. For competition is the single most powerful tool available to the department to drive productivity. We must stop deluding ourselves with the idea that directed buys from 2 designated suppliers represents real competition. We are already cutting down on directed buys with the Navy's Littoral Combat Ship, where we have set in place real competition that will save more than $1 billion in the next 5 years alone, with additional savings expected over the life of the LCS program. Competition is not always available, but the evidence is clear that the government is not availing itself of all possible competitive situations. Fourth, and this is an area where I think we especially owe a debt to the Subcommittee on Acquisition Reform because of its focus on this question, we will more aggressively manage the over $200 billion we spend annually on services, such as information technology and knowledge-based services, facilities upkeep, weapon system maintenance, and transportation. When most people think of the defense budget, they think of ships and planes. But more than 50% of our contract spending, as I noted earlier, is for services. And believe it or not, our practices for buying such services are even less effective than for buying weapon systems. Fifth, we're taking steps to reduce unproductive processes and bureaucracy by reducing the number of OSD-level reviews to those necessary to support major investment decisions or to uncover and respond to significant program execution issues. Eliminating low value-added statutory processes, and reducing the volume and cost of both internal and congressional reports as appropriate. Changing our business practices will take time and require the continued close involvement of our industry partners. We also need your support, which is essential to the success of this endeavor. We have every reason to believe that the efficiencies we seek can be realized. First, we've established reasonable reduction targets. Second, we're focused on specific savings of the kind that I described. Third, it's reasonable to assume that after an era of double-digit budget growth, there's fat that's crept in and that we can find savings. And finally, President Obama, Secretary Gates, Deputy Secretary Lynn, you, this committee, both houses, in fact, of Congress, in legislation both last year and this year, have shown that you expect it and the American taxpayers expect it. The alternative, also worth considering, is unacceptable. Broken or canceled programs rather than managed programs, budget turbulence, uncertainty for industry, erosion of taxpayer confidence in the care with which we spend their money on national defense, and of course, especially lost capability for the warfighter in a dangerous world. So we not only can succeed, but we must. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. General Cartwright, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative McKeon, distinguished members of the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Defense efficiency initiatives. A few points of context. We remain a nation at war, and that is not lost on us. Troops are deployed around the world, many engaged in combat. We are committed to ensuring these troops are properly supported. Second, DOD is a bureaucracy that has not fully adapted its processes and constructs to the information age, as Dr. Carter just described. We must be able to adapt with increased speed in order to ensure we remain competitive. In an era of rapidly evolving threats, our success depends on our ability to adapt quickly. Third, DOD is cognizant of the nation's financial situation. We do not expect budgets to grow at the rate they grew over the last decade. When developing grand strategy, it is the first duty of the strategist to appreciate the financial position of his or her nation. We demonstrated this appreciation during last year's weapons systems portfolio changes, and earlier this year in the process to release our strategic reviews. The Secretary's efficiency initiatives are aimed at seeking the same effect in our organizations. These initiatives are not a cut, but rather a shift of resources from overhead to the warfighter, increasing the tooth-to-tail ratio. Regarding the disestablishment of Joint Forces Command, JFCOM has helped to accomplish the primary goal for which it was established, to drive jointness throughout the military. We must continue along the positive vectors regarding joint activities as directed in the Goldwater-Nichols legislation. We must also improve initiatives to strengthen efforts in the interagency and combined arenas. It is our goal to reduce unintended redundancies and layering, to more clearly align operational responsibilities with service, train, and equip functions in order to reduce inefficiencies as forces are presented to combatant commands. At all the COCOMs, we must consolidate functions where appropriate and where functions are retained, move towards a construct of combined, joint, interagency task force organizations and centers. The combined interagency aspects are a critical component in establishing baseline capacity and surge expectations of the force. As the cyber domain continues to grow in importance, the Department will look to ensure lines of authority and responsibility are clear and adaptable. We intend to focus cyber operations in Cyber Command. We will align policy and oversight activities in a strengthened DOD Chief Information Officer. Finally, we must align cyber requirements and cyber acquisition to maximize support to the operational activities. Given the expanding role and criticality of information and the networks that hold and transmit that information, we need to manage DoD systems in the cyber domain as we do any other operational system. To ensure our success, IT systems must have the proper architecture and capability to ensure adaptability and innovation. Further, our architectures should enable collaboration throughout the joint interagency, coalition, and commercial partnerships that we engage in. The free flow of information among these players is integral to our strategies. The Department's information systems must extend to the tactical edge and must work when others do not. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
General, thank you very much. I have spent a great deal of time and effort over a period of years pursuing jointness. I was in on the ground floor 1982, an effort that was begun by Richard White of Texas. I introduced legislation in 1983. My first bill abolished the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I found that none of them had a sense of humor. But the House passed on 3 different occasions legislation to create jointness, and in 1986, with the new chairman in the Senate, Barry Goldwater, and the able assistance and leadership of Bill Nichols of our committee, a bill was passed into law called Goldwater-Nichols, which created, in fact, jointness. Now, it took some time for the joint culture to come about, but it did. The services saluted and did well. And I, to this day, wish to compliment all those present and past who helped create the jointness based upon the law that we passed known as Goldwater-Nichols. So that leads me to my first question, Secretary Lynn, if I may. The Joint Forces Command is a subject of elimination. If that comes to pass, who within the department will have as its central mission the job to advocate and develop and disseminate joint operating concepts, doctrine, and training? Would we be throwing away all of the efforts that began with Goldwater-Nichols should that happen? I'm very concerned about where that will go, how much thought has gone into that, and will our military be better off as a result? But answer the first question, Secretary Lynn. Who assumes that duty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We too recognize the importance of jointness in our training, in our doctrine, and in our operations, and appreciate the role you played in the 80s and Goldwater-Nichols and the subsequent events. And as you indicated, those efforts have been successful in changing the whole culture of the department. The COCOMs operate very differently than they did during the first Gulf War when jointness was not adequate. The services operate very differently than they did in the 70s and the 80s in the actions that led to the Goldwater-Nichols legislation. We do think that since the department is in a different place, that it is possible to eliminate the Joint Forces Command, to eliminate this four-star billion-dollar headquarters, but retain the culture of jointness. You asked where the leadership will come from. The leadership will come from the joint staff. The leadership will now come from the services and the COCOMs themselves because of the efforts of Goldwater-Nichols, because of the work of the Joint Forces Command. The joint doctrine, training, and operations will continue to be a strong part of the department.
Where does it go again?
The leader, as I said, the leadership in terms of training and doctrine, so much of it will come from the Joint Chiefs and the Joint Staff, but the place that we're in is fundamentally different than the one that we were in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. We have a much stronger joint culture inside the military departments and the military services themselves, and the combatant commands inherently operate jointly and have a joint ethos as part of how they operate.
All right. Our committee has asked for a range of information on how the department reached the decision to disestablish the Joint Forces Command. Thus far, we have not received the information. Mr. Secretary, when will the information be forthcoming?
Mr. Chairman, we've provided, I think, briefings to the staff. We've provided an extensive...
No, I'm not talking about briefings. I'm talking about information. Sheets of paper.
Pieces of paper. We've provided, I think, an extensive legal opinion on the relevance of the BRAC legislation. We've provided the task force memos, and we'll continue to answer the committee's questions and provide the documentation and the material the committee needs as we as the task force moves into the implementation phase. There'll be much more material available for the committee.
Have you provided everything for which we have asked?
I'm not sure the committee would agree with that. We have been trying to be as responsive to the committee's questions as possible, and we're going to continue to do so. If there's specific pieces of information that you think we need, I'm happy to follow up, I'm happy to follow up for the record.
For the record, I would like to receive the copy of the memorandum for Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Director, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, Subject, Joint Forces Command Disestablishment Working Group. I would like to have a copy of that piece of information, please. Mr. McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I alluded in my opening statement, it's critical that the department provide this committee with as much information as possible about its plans to improve efficiencies, where cuts will come from, where reinvestment will occur, and the impact of each of those changes in terms of current and future operations. This is no more true than in the case of the proposed closure of U.S. Joint Forces Command. The stand-up or closure of a combatant command deserves close scrutiny. It represents a major organizational and functional shift within the department and a significant change for the workforce. To that end, on August 10th, during a briefing to HASC staff and members staffed by Secretary Hale and other senior leaders, several documents were requested regarding the closure of JFCOM. By the end of the month, no such information had been provided. Now, the chairman just asked about some of that. I want to be even a little more specific. On August 31st, I, along with two of my ranking members, Representative Randy Forbes and Representative Rob Whitman, sent a letter to Secretary Gates requesting the same information. Nearly a month later, just yesterday, we finally received a reply. I want to thank Secretary Gates for responding and to thank you for any role that you may have played in providing additional information. However, not only was the response extremely tardy, but it was incomplete. My colleagues and I requested the DOD General Counsel, Legal Counsel about the applicability of the BRAC law, a copy of the recommendation and analysis provided by senior staff to the Secretary of Defense regarding the closure of USGFCOM, any business case analysis conducted relating to this initiative. Finally, terms of reference provided to task force charged with implementing closure of USGFCOM. Now, we received the General Counsel's legal opinion and the terms of reference for the task force, but not the senior staff's analysis, nor any business case analysis. Secretary Lynn, will the department immediately provide the committee with the requested materials?
Mr. McKeon, let me address the business case issue because it's come up repeatedly. The decision to disestablish or to recommend disestablishment of the Joint Forces Command was not based on a business case, it was based on a military rationale. It was based on a review of the Uniform Command Plan and what the central purposes of the Joint Forces Command were, the provision of forces, joint training and doctrine, joint experimentation. After 30 meetings on those subjects with his senior military leaders and his senior civilian advisors, the Secretary concluded that those missions no longer justified a four-star billion-dollar command, and he so recommended to the President. So it was a military rationale that caused the Secretary to recommend the disestablishment of the Joint Forces Command, not a business case.
So there was nothing regarding any business was involved in the decision?
The Secretary looked at the growth of the Joint Forces Command. It tripled over the last decade with no fundamental change in its mission, so that caused him to look at that military rationale. And we're now engaged in a review, center by center, function by function, as to which centers and which functions need to be retained and where they would be retained. And in that review, the results of which we will provide to the committee, of course, we are looking at the business case.
May I ask when?
As we develop the courses of action and the recommendations, it will be over the course of the fall.
I think probably one of the problems the committee, or at least myself as a member of the committee, are having is the things that we've asked for are late in coming or incomplete in coming, and we can't seem to get an answer as to when we will get those things that we've asked for. And then you tell us that you've made decisions, you're moving forward, like we have no say whatsoever or no way to deal with this. And it leaves us somewhat frustrated. I think you can see from both the chairman and myself the questions we have. I'm not saying that we're against this, it's just that we haven't seen the rationale or the total we don't understand totally the why and the wherefore. And we still have questions about that. And when I ask when or if you'll immediately give us this information, what's the response? You start talking about that it's not a business decision, it was a military decision. Okay, so you made no business analysis. Is that what I'm understanding?
No, what I'm saying is that there was a military rationale. I've tried in my testimony to summarize that rationale. We'll try and provide you. I understand you want more material on that. We'll try and provide that.
I understand that you made.
I'm trying to say that on the issues of the budgets and how much savings there will be, which is I think what you mean by a business case, that's being developed now. We think we'll be able to save a substantial part of that $1 billion. We have not developed all of the recommendations that lead to the savings. We have developed the rationale that caused the Secretary to recommend disestablishment. The second phase is then to review which pieces stay, which pieces go, and what the net result in terms of savings are. And I think that's, when you're saying business case, I think that's what you want. I'm saying that's underway right now, and we will provide it to the committee.
Okay, so what you said is you made no business decision. You think that as time goes on, you will look for savings, and that is probably what what we're talking about when we ask for business information on it.
I'm trying, I guess, to understand that's where you're going. I think that is.
I'm not too articulate.
But you're very articulate.
But some of the things we're asking. Let me go back then to. We'll eventually, I guess, we'll get something about the business analysis. But what about the military rationale document? Can we get that?
Well, we think we've answered that question in the testimony, in the briefings, in the material we provided, in the legal opinion. But I will go back to the department and see if there's more material or a fuller explanation that we can provide if the committee thinks it requires it.
This committee, Mr. Secretary, is the most supportive of the military in Congress, the members of this committee. And we're not trying to be obstructionist. We're supportive of what you're trying to do. We just need to understand more fully where you're coming from. There was a lot of rationale to set up JEFCOM, and now you're saying there's a lot of rationale to eliminate it. The chairman asked, who's going to take over that responsibility of jointness? And you said, well, we're in a different place now, and I guess we don't need it anymore. We just need to understand that more completely. Let me ask another question. I share the Secretary's concern that the growth in the department's top line is insufficient to address the future capabilities required by the military. 1% real growth in the defense budget over the next 5 years is a net cut for investment and procurement accounts. And this is not just my view. The independent bipartisan QDR panel appointed by Congress recognized this fact. The co-chairman of that independent panel, Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense under President Clinton, and Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor under President George W. Bush, echo the concerns of many on the committee. Their report rightly states that our nation cannot afford business as usual and warns of a potential train wreck coming in the areas of personnel acquisition and force structure. Significantly, the report offers a realistic view of the global security environment, that maintaining and growing our alliances will place an increased demand on American hard power and require an increase in our military's force structure. With that in mind, I'm fully supportive of efforts to identify unnecessary overhead or low-priority programs. If we can translate that savings into force structure and modernization accounts, but we cannot be naive. Secretary Lynn, what specific commitments, if any, have you or the Secretary received from the administration that they will not attempt to harvest this savings for non-defense spending, and that they will oppose any attempt by the Congress to do so? And secondly, should you be successful in reinvesting $100 billion over the next 5 years into force structure and modernization accounts, how much more funding will be required to see sustained growth of 2 to 3% in these accounts? And how do you propose to achieve this growth?
Well, answering the last question first, Mr. McKeon, the $100 billion number comes from what we think it takes to get from the 1% top-line growth to a 2 to 3% growth in the accounts that you're focused on, the force structure and the modernization accounts. That's how that calculation was done. We have the support of the administration for the budget plan that we've presented of 1% real growth, and we have been trying to get the support of Congress. Of course, we haven't heard the final bell on that yet. I guess I would come back, Mr. McKeon, the challenge here is that everyone supports our effort in general, supports reform in general, but has problems with each of the particular recommendations, such as the Joint Forces Command to eliminate redundancy, to take out layering, to take out headquarters. But I understand these are tough decisions, but if we don't make these tough decisions, we will not get that $100 billion.
Well, you haven't given us any savings yet for JEFCOM. You said you haven't done a business analysis yet to come up with any savings. That was a military decision. So to count that in the $100 billion is probably not
Well, fair enough, and there will be, before we submit the budget in fiscal 12, there will be savings coming from this initiative.
Okay, we're hoping there will be. Yeah. We haven't seen that analysis yet. We're just assuming at this point that there will be some savings generated.
And it's a fair question to get that analysis before you judge it.
And that's what we asked for back in the letter, and that's what we would still like to see. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
As I understand it, you don't know how much you would save in efficiency by elimination of that command?
We don't have the net number yet. We know it costs about $1 billion to operate that command every year, and we know we're going to eliminate portions of that, the headquarters and some of the other functions, and that will save some money, and we'll provide that analysis, I think what Mr. McKeon called the business case analysis, as we proceed this fall.
As I see it, Mr. Secretary, somebody is going to have to ride a shotgun on jointness. I think that's a given. The services could very well resort to stovepipe activities without that joint doctrine being enforced one way or the other. That really worries me.
Let me ask General Cartwright to comment on that, if I can.
By the way, Goldwater Nichols almost didn't include your job, General Cartwright, but we got it.
I'm sincerely appreciative. Congressman, you know, as we looked at this activity, I tend to be much aligned, and we have had many conversations over the years about jointness and the incentives that drive us to joint. And we were clearly in need of getting more horsepower behind building in jointness to our force when we moved to the construct of Joint Forces Command. That was clear. And it was clear particularly in the areas of essential training, the essential task lists that we work with, which we call military essential task lists. These are the things that the units use to train their people and certify their people in their functionality. But they were doing it to service medals rather than to joint. So one of the first tasks that we had to have when we stood up Joint Forces Command is we had to have sufficient horsepower in the command, authority, aligned and able to say, this is what we want you to do, and to develop those joint operating concepts, which we worked so hard on for the latter part of the 90s, along with the essential task lists necessary to certify a unit joint. About 3 years ago, we started to transition the responsibility to certify those units to the services, because those training activities, the essential task lists had been developed, and the concepts and the services were in fact demonstrating, both through their infrastructure, the training ranges, the capabilities, that they could in fact do this and would do this and saw the value in it. That was the heart of why we needed Joint Forces Command, why we needed that 4-star to actually be there to drive this. I'm not saying joint and the journey to joint is done, but the hard work that we put into building those training regimens, building those training ranges, building the distributed modeling and simulation that bring these forces together and allow us to do our work has by and large been accomplished. The question is, how do we sustain it? And I agree with you, who's responsible? Who gets up every morning worried about, is this force going to stay joint? We're working our way through several courses of action that are associated with that. It's going to have to be somebody. Somebody has to be accountable for that activity. We're working on that. We have several options that we're going to develop, and we will provide the committee with the results and with those choices and with the analysis that we perform. But at the end of the day, I am where you are. Somebody has to get up every morning believing they're in charge of this.
That's an excellent answer. However, there should have been an answer in place before announcing to disband this particular command, don't you think, General? You announced you're going to get rid of it, and then we'll find a replacement. Come on.
Mr. Chairman, we understand and we believe that when we looked at it as the Joint Chiefs and made our recommendation to the Secretary, that we could in fact draw down from a 4-star command to some other organizational construct. However, in the development of what we are doing in the business case and in all of the other elements of this activity, when we look at the full range of courses of action, status quo is an option. It is an option that we will fully investigate as to whether or not it is the option or it is not. But we are also looking at a full range from status quo to breaking down into agencies, other commands, assumption by other commands, divestiture completely. That full range is going to be considered as we develop this case and present our options to the Secretary. I do not feel, because the Secretary set an objective of eliminating Joint Forces Command, that option is removed from us in consideration. Now, quite frankly, we believe that we will be able to, in fact, reduce below a 4-star command this activity, but it's still on the table.
Well, thank you for that. I hope you will keep in mind that services, by nature, will go back to the stovepipe doctrines of the past. And there needs to be a joint activity to make this a continued success of jointness. Mr. Ortiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Lynn, Secretary Carter, General Cartwright. I know that you have huge responsibilities and serious obligations, but as I said before, in the same boat, so do we. You know, and I think that the Joint Forces Command, correct me if I'm wrong, came about because of the lessons learned during the first Persian Gulf. And the reason that at least this member is a little leery is that we established a base in Ingleside, Texas, because of the lessons learned during the Persian Gulf, which was mine warfare. That base has since been closed, has been moved someplace else at a huge cost because where they moved did not have the infrastructure. This is why sometimes we are leery as to what is going on, all these studies, and you know, when we want to buy something, and we know that we need it, the longer that we wait, the more that it is going to cost. But you know, Secretary Gates stated that there will be a 10% reduction in service contractors for each of the next 3 years. And my question is, 10% of what? What exactly is everything being considered for the cuts? Historically, since I've been here, civilian personnel freezes have led to increased contracting out by huge numbers. What mechanism is being put into place to ensure that contractors will not simply be substituted for civilians? And I believe in contracting out when it makes sense. When in many instances, it doesn't make sense. And I would like to hear what your overarching plan is to include operational energy as part of your broader review of efficiencies, and also to hear what steps DOD is taking now to get cutting-edge technologies to the theater, to change the culture, and to reduce our demand for fuel. I know I've given you 3 questions, but anyone that would like to tackle these questions?
I'm going to ask Dr. Carter to address your operational energy question. There is quite a lot we're doing, and it's within his office. But before I do that, let me answer your question on consultants. I think Secretary Gates had exactly the same perspective that you had, that often when we freeze civilian personnel, as has happened in the past, it just causes growth in what we call service support contracts. And what I mean by that is basically contracts which provide staff augmentation to government workers. I'm not meaning people who do depot maintenance or do functional responsibilities related to warfighting. These are staff augmentees, and they have grown in the last 10 years by about a factor of 3. Secretary Gates thinks that growth was largely uncontrolled, in some cases perhaps unintended. At least it wasn't centrally directed. The reductions that he's directing, the 10% per year, is intended to rein that back in, to try and get some more sense of balance between government workers and service support contractors. We certainly need both. We cannot operate without contractors, but we do think that we've gotten out of balance over the last 10 years, and so we're working to restore that balance as we go forward and as we look to reduce overhead in the department. Let me ask Secretary Carter to address the energy question.
Thank you. Very important question, and I'm delighted to say that finally our Director of Operational Energy, Sharon Burke, was confirmed a few months ago, so she's in the seat now. Very important role, and I'll give you a few examples of the kind of problems that she's looking at. A few weeks ago, I was at Bagram Air Base at the fuel depot, where fuel trucks come in and we basically buy at the gate, paying $4.28 a gallon, not bad, at the gate of Bagram Air Base for fuel, much of which is trucked in from Central Asia through mountain passes and so forth. A great example of a logistics effort to decrease the cost of operational energy, that is energy at the operational end. Down in the Kandahar area, we're doing insulation of tentage there, so you're not air conditioning a tent, which anybody can realize is an inefficient way to do business. So we've learned a lot about operational energy, and Ms. Burke is really pushing that forward. May I also take the opportunity, Congressman Ortiz, you talked about getting cutting-edge technology to the theater. If you read my directive to the acquisition workforce that I indicated, that I issued a couple weeks ago and indicated I'd put in the record, it says that achieving these efficiencies described in this memorandum is your second highest priority. Your first highest priority is to support the ongoing wars. That is my charge to the acquisition workforce, and you see us in the MRAPs, in ISR, and everything else we're trying to do, make sure that people realize it's not just about buying tomorrow's weapon system that's efficiently and effectively and high-end, but also about supporting conflict that is ongoing. I just wanted to make that point because I feel very strongly about it.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you very much. Dr. Parkinson noted that as the British Navy became smaller and smaller, the Admiralty, their equivalent of our Pentagon, grew larger and larger. He also noted that an organization consumes energy with internal communication, and the larger the bureaucracy grows, the more of its energies are consumed with internal communications. And he noted that at some point, a different point for different types of organizations, they become so large that essentially all of their energies are consumed with internal communication and nothing gets done outside. Our defense establishment has not escaped these inherent characteristics of bureaucracies, and so it's very important that we take a look, and thank you for doing that. The question is the current suggestion of doing away with the Joint Forces Command, which problem might be solved by other means, by the way, that we might need to discuss. Is it possible that this suggested cure might be worse than the disease? Because his district is so impacted by this, I would like to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Randy Forbes.
I thank my friend from Maryland, and General Cartwright, I thank you for being here, but I'm not going to ask you any questions for two reasons. The first one is because we've basically seen what this administration does to people in uniform who disagree with them. But secondly, Secretary Lynn wasn't completely forthcoming when he said that the department was soliciting ideas from people about all of these issues, because what wasn't disclosed is you'd put a gag order or a non-disclosure agreement on the people doing this in the Joint Forces Command, where anybody that disagrees with you can't even talk to members of Congress or couldn't be here today to talk about these issues. And, Mr. Secretary, I'd ask you this question this morning. Who do you serve? Who do you work for? If that's the case, then you made the comment that President Obama and Secretary Gates were supportive of these reforms. Is it your testimony today that President Obama has signed off on the reform proposal to shut down the Joint Forces Command?
No, sir. As we discussed yesterday morning, the Secretary made that recommendation.
So then you misspoke when you said that the President and Secretary Gates is a Secretary Gates proposal. And the second thing I'd ask you is this. You said to the ranking member that it was a fair question to get the analysis before you judge it. If that's the case, did the Secretary get the analysis? And if he got the analysis, why in the world won't you give it to this committee to look at it? And let me just go back and say this. You know, this should be a debate, as my friend from Maryland said, about whether we should shut down the Joint Forces Command, other efficiencies, but we can't have that debate because you have just refused to give us the information. Some of us may disagree. My friend from South Carolina, my friend from Texas, my friend from Florida, they all might disagree and think it should be shut down or not, but we can't have that debate because you've refused to give us a scintilla of evidence. You know, the Pentagon has woven a tapestry of silence that is deafening to the sounds of liberty itself. The end doesn't justify the means. Let's just look at some of the facts. You've had 11 years of testimony out in the public, of written analysis that we could look at for joint forces and jointness in the Joint Forces Command, and you've had 90 days of backroom meetings, and they've all been backroom. And when you talk about meetings, it could be just two people talking with each other, and you talk about these 30 meetings, but you've refused to give us one bit of the evidence. And when you come in here, you're blending apples and oranges. You say there's no business case, yet it was the business board recommendation that we all first heard about this closure. So the business board is making military policy, not business decisions. And then on the first briefings that you came in, you said you didn't know what the cost savings were. Shouldn't you have at least looked at those cost savings before you made the analysis? We all know from BRAC that sometimes you guys come in here and tell us all this money we're going to save from shutting down facilities, and it ends up costing us more money rather than saving money, and you say it's a philosophical decision, but it's not a philosophical decision to the folks who are losing their homes right now in Virginia, to the $250 million deal that didn't close last week because of your decision, to the restaurants and businesses that are shutting up because you didn't make that decision. And my time is out, Mr. Chairman. I will look forward to asking some more questions when I get my own time.
Mr. Chairman, I need to respond to a couple of those points.
Go ahead.
First, Mr. Forbes, the recommendation the Secretary made, and you correctly described it as a recommendation to the President. He's had extensive discussions with the President about that recommendation and all the recommendations he's made, but with regard to the disestablishment of the Joint Forces Command, the President has not yet made a decision. The Secretary's recommendation was not based on the Defense Business Board. The Defense Business Board is an independent and parallel activity that came to the same conclusion, but the Secretary's decision, his recommendation, was based on his consultation primarily with his military advisors. These were not meetings with one or two people in the room. These were meetings with the chairman, with the vice chairman, with the chiefs, with senior civilian advisors, with the commanders, both incoming and outgoing, of the Joint Forces Command. With regard to the rationale, this is a two-part exercise. The rationale to recommend disestablishment was based not on the economics, but on the military rationale. And I've gone into that in some detail. I won't repeat it, but I know you'll have another chance for questions, and we can do that then. The savings, there's $1 billion. I'm sure we will save a substantial part of that $1 billion, and that will be the business case, and we will provide that to the committee when we have it. We have provided to the committee the military rationale for the recommendation for closure. As a bottom line point, Mr. Forbes, I fully understand this is a very, very tough decision. It is particularly tough for the area around Norfolk, we are going to work very hard to work with those people to help that adjustment.
Mr. Lynn, you have not done that. If you're going to work hard with them, you could have at least taken their calls from the governor. You could have at least given them some information. And you still stonewall us today. But I'll ask my question in just a couple minutes.
I met with the governor as well as yourself yesterday morning, and we'll continue to do that.
Mr. Taylor, please.
Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'm going to yield my time to Mr. Nye and claim his time when it's his turn.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, for yielding. Thank you, Chairman, for holding this, this set of hearings. Secretary Lynn, you said that this was a military decision, not a business case decision, and that this is essentially a military versus not a civilian decision. I disagree. I just want to say I agree with my colleague, Congressman Forbes, and with Senator Webb, who yesterday said essentially this is, at the end boils down to a civilian decision because it's going to be made by the President on a recommendation by the Secretary. But just talking about the military side of things, I want to read quickly a quote from the former commander at JIFCOM, Admiral Hal Gaiman, who said, "I disagree with the Secretary of Defense's message that jointness in military operations has been achieved and the job is done." Goes on to say, Gates' decision to close JIFCOM is abandoning a decades-long effort initiated and supported by multiple Secretaries of Defense and Chairmen of the Joint Chief of Staff to ensure maximum effectiveness of our armed forces. Aside from hearing from General Cartwright yesterday morning at a meeting we had and in testimony today, this is the only other military expert that we've been able to have access to hear his thoughts on the issue. So I think it's fair at the very minimum to say that there is some disagreement or different points of view on the military side here. Now, we understand at some point we got to come to a decision on what to do on this issue. I accept that. But I do want to say I strongly share Chairman Skelton and Ranking Member McKeon's skepticism in the secretive nature of the discussions that have gone on in the Defense Department on this issue, particularly on something that has the kind of impact that potentially disestablishing a four-star command could have. And I have to tell you, I get the feeling that the department doesn't seem to believe that there's a role for Congress in this decision-making, given the fact that the recommendation has already been announced. I will concede the point that you today, I think we're moving forward actually, have said you agree that an analysis needs to be done. And when I say analysis, I'm talking about what disestablishing the command or what any other route that we might end up taking would cost, how much it would save, what the specific effects would be on our military, and how we would ensure to carry out those important functions that even the Secretary has said he knows JIFCOM does. He said there are some important functions there that need to be carried out. What I'm concerned about is the fact that the Secretary has made the recommendation before the analysis done that even you have said today is an important part of the decision-making process on where to go here. What I want to ask you is if you will commit to including us, not just as a committee, but the Virginia delegation and the governor's made many requests to sit down with the Secretary of Defense face-to-face. If you will make a commitment to arrange that meeting to allow us to have the input in this analysis process that you have described before implementation would proceed with this proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Nye. As we discussed yesterday morning directly with the governor and yourself and some other members of the delegation, we will indeed ensure that the governor and elected members of the Virginia delegation have an opportunity to meet with the Secretary sometime this fall before final decisions are made on implementation. And we will solicit your views and make sure we have a channel that the information that you think needs to be before the department before we made that decision indeed is before the department.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate your recognition that we should have a role in the process. I have to say I'm unhappy with the performance of the department to date in terms of involving us in that discussion. I will say I'm happy to note now that you have offered to include us more rigorously in the analytics before any decision is implemented, and I thank you for that. Just want to close by saying and reminding the other members of this committee, and I think you've had an opportunity so far to get a little bit of a flavor of kind of where this committee is on the decision-making process here. Reminding the other members of the committee that the proposed closure of Joint Forces Command represents, based on a number that we've been given by the department previously, only 1/4% of the Secretary's plan to realign $100 billion in defense priorities. And as we provide oversight over the Secretary's plan, we will demand strategic cost-benefit analysis of those decisions, because it's our job to provide oversight over the DOD, and it's also our job to our constituents back home to ensure that a large DOD brush doesn't sweep away thousands of jobs in our district without proper justification and without rationale. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me say, Ms. Secretary, that I am deeply concerned that the years of creating the joint culture and the enforcement thereof could go down the river and be lost. And as long as I am chairman, I'm going to do my best to make sure that that culture stays and that it is enforced. It's come at too much effort, not just by Congress, but by so many outstanding leaders who wear the uniform. They made it happen, and I don't want to see that slip away. And if I have any message for you, Mr. Secretary, I hope you understand that.
Do understand it and share the objective, Mr. Chairman. As we discussed, we're not sure the Joint Forces Command is the right conduit going forward, but appreciate there may be differences about that.
Mr. Forbes,
Thank you,
your regular time.
Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to request unanimous approval to submit to the record a statement by the Governor of Virginia, a statement by the City of Suffolk, Virginia, and also questions that we have requested that be asked by the Department.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, also have enormous respect for you, and one of the things that frightens me about Secretary Lynn's testimony today is he specifically says he doesn't believe there's any risk of reverting back to the pre-Goldwater-Nicholas Act of jointness. I think there's a huge risk. Might not be concerned about all of the cost to the Commonwealth of Virginia. I don't expect members here to be concerned, but we should be concerned about this. Number one news story on the day this was announced in the Communist Chinese press was the closure of the Joint Forces Command and how it was going to help them, because their number one weakness when they're working with the Russians has always been jointness. Secondly, it's coming to a theater near you. If they can do this process here and not have any kind of openness and not include anybody, they'll do it anywhere across the country. The third thing is we've just sent a message out to all of our partners across America. You better be careful when you deal with the Department of Defense, because don't count on them being open and having a process. If they just decide they're going to close something, they'll make that decision and get the analysis later. And I want to go back to what I was talking about, Mr. Secretary, with this cloud of lack of transparency that you guys have pulled down the drapes in the Pentagon. Last year, and I understand why, because we haven't really, as a committee, held you accountable to that. Last year, you issued a gag order that prohibited any of the individuals at the Department of Defense from even talking to members of Congress about the ramifications of some of your cuts. We had hearings that were canceled because people couldn't come here and testify. And what did we do about it? This committee did nothing. When you refused by the requirement you have by law to give us a shipbuilding plan so we'd know what you were doing with building ships, and we asked you in every way we could, and you just refused to do it, what do we do about it? We didn't do anything. When you were required by law to give us an aviation plan, and you just refused to do it, and we asked you and asked you and asked you, and you just failed, we didn't do anything about it. You've had 11 years of testimony, analysis supporting Joint Forces Command. You make 90 days of backroom meetings, and you come in here and give us conclusions but no analysis. What are we going to do about that? Not a scintilla of evidence. You wouldn't respond to members of Congress, both the Senate and this Republicans and Democrats. My friend, Congressman Scott, has been right with us on asking this. He's had the same kind of problems that we've had. The governor of Virginia, you met with him yesterday. You went 7 weeks, wouldn't even return his telephone calls to just sit down and say, what are you doing and how are you doing it? Yesterday at the so-called meeting that you had with us, you wouldn't let the press come in. We asked you to let the press come in. You took our telephones away, any recording devices, and there wasn't any classified information or anything that had executive privileges, but you just don't want the public to know some of this information. You've issued a gag order to the personnel in Joint Forces Command, refusing to let them talk if they have a counter opinion to yours. And one of the questions I'd have for you today is, will you give us a copy? Will you give the chairman and the ranking member a copy of that order that you made them sign, that non-disclosure agreement today? You know, at some point in time, Mr. Chairman, enough is enough. We need the analysis and we need the facts. I think this is the time. And Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, we so respect both of you, but today we'll be sending you a letter that's going to be signed by Democrats and Republicans, and not just people from Virginia, requesting that we have backed up, we've drawn a line in the sand, we've said, please give us this information, you've refused. We've backed up again and drawn a line in the sand, and you've just refused. We've backed up again and drawn a line in the sand, and you've refused. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, we're going to request that if they keep pushing us against this wall, that this committee issue a subpoena to them, requiring this information be given to us, because I think it's right for the American people. And Mr. Lynn, I'll just close by saying this. You may work for the President, you might work for the Secretary of Defense, but you do work for the American people. They're the ones that pay your bills. They're the ones that send their sons and daughters to fight our wars, and they have a right to know this information. And we ought to be able to give them this analysis and put it on the table, because as the chairman said, we can't afford to go back. And we need, as part of a Congress, not to have to come with our hat in our hand pleading for you to give us crumbs of information. We ought to be able to come to you and you give us the analysis and the information so that we can do the due diligence we have to have an oversight function to protect the greatest military the world has ever known. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Dr. Snyder.
Mr. Secretary, do you want to respond to anything Mr. Forbes had to say?
Just a couple of things. Thank you, Mr. Snyder. One, I think, Mr. Forbes, the one thing we're agreed on, I do work for the American people. It's what I said in response to your answer, and I hope you weren't implying that I said something else. Just on the couple of the factual points, we have provided the committee with the shipbuilding plan. We have provided the committee with an aviation plan. I know you the committee would have liked it in the first month or two of the administration. We didn't have people confirmed. We provided it when we built it. There was no plan when you requested it. We built it over the course of the first year, and we've provided it now to the committee.
Mr. Chairman, because I always like to hear what Mr. Critz has to say, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Critz.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, obviously, I had some questions that I was going to ask, but after listening to Mr. Forbes' testimony, you know, I go back to the briefing that we received. It says the DOD indicates that though some analysis was done leading up to the decision to eliminate the command, the detailed plan for doing so will be developed over the upcoming year. And it is frustrating, because if we're working together and good decisions are being made, certainly we're going to agree on them. But I think I can understand the frustration is that if we're not included in any of these decisions, but we're the authorizing committee, it sort of gets a little dicey as to what do we support, what don't we support, are we working together for the American people? But quickly, my question would be, you know, going back to 1993 when President Clinton and Vice President Gore came in, they reinvented government, and a lot of civilian Pentagon employees were eliminated over that time, and most of that was sucked up into contractors. But during that time, the O&M budget stayed pretty consistent with the ECI, with inflation. It's been those last 10 years, though, that it's been pretty extensive how it's grown. So my question to you is that when you're looking at this shrinking of the Defense Department, are we shrinking on O&M? Are we shrinking on procurement? What's sort of the split on how that's going to be addressed?
The focus of the Secretary's initiatives is on what he's described as overhead. Now, much of the overhead is in the O&M account, but not all of it. And so we've asked the services and all the defense agencies to put forward proposals to develop $100 billion in overhead cuts and to shift those resources into the warfighting accounts. That will probably lead to some restraint in the growth of the O&M accounts, but how much I couldn't tell you right now.
So there's really no general idea that 90% of it's coming out of O&M and 10% is coming out of procurement. There's really no idea.
The focus is on overhead. We're going to evaluate the specific proposals, and then it will fall where it does in the budget.
Okay. So when you're looking forward and you're looking to cut your budget, where does the future combat system fall in this debate?
Well, the future combat system is an Army modernization system for its fleet of vehicles. The Secretary restructured that last year, feeling that it was not focused sufficiently on the lessons that we'd learned coming out of combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly with respect to IEDs, and that's now being restructured. The lead element of that is a ground combat vehicle, which will probably be the first element out of the restructured program, and Mr. Carter could go into more detail on that if you'd like.
Well, we just saw that the future combat, or the ground combat vehicle, there's going to be a rebidding. So is that part of the savings that we're looking for going forward, or what is the plan here?
With respect to the ground combat vehicle, which is one of the elements of what used to be future combat systems, the RFP that the Army issued several months ago, we have pulled back because it did not contain the right acquisition strategy. I think the intersection of ground combat vehicle, and the efficiencies initiative lies in the area that I described earlier, particularly the affordability as a requirement idea. So as we look at the ground combat vehicle, just like the Navy has done with SSB&X, as the Army looks at the ground combat vehicle, we're looking at each element of the design, all the drivers of the design, internal power, the number of troops that the vehicle can carry, the hardness of the vehicle, gunnery, and so forth, and looking at the way in which each of those requirements drives cost and making sure that we're making the right trade-off. That is, at the point at which we're getting a diminishing return of military capability for a continuing investment, that we cap the requirement at that point. Doing that for each of the design parameters on the vehicle, and thereby getting a well-rounded overall design, so that the vehicle that we put out an RFP for the technology development phase, which is our next step, is one that the Army is actually going to be able to afford when it comes time to buy it. 7 years to first production vehicle, then a period of production. You can look out at the Army budget at that time and say, what else are they going to be doing? They're going to be doing light vehicles, heavy vehicles, in addition to this armored vehicle. They have other investments to make, and we want to make sure that we're building a vehicle that is in fact affordable while also having the military capability they want. The savings on that will be, you can think of in two categories. One is that it may be that the resulting design is one that allows us to spend less over the next 5 years than we had originally planned, in which case that's a savings that can be part of the $100 billion. But I think for that particular project, the body of the savings will be in the out years when it comes time to design to procure a vehicle that is better designed for affordability than would have been the case if we had followed the RFP of 4 months ago.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here this morning. We'll talk about some of the sides, Joint Forces Command. My antenna went up when I heard in September, I guess on August 9th, that Secretary Gates' scheme was to cut overhead and back office and those kind of things in order to adjust these numbers, and specifically mentioned the Business Transformation Agency and NII as well as being redundant, inefficient, inexplicably worthless, and on the chopping block for this $100 billion nut. A couple questions. Did you come up with $101 billion as a goal or did you build a case from the bottom up saying, here are these things, and you just got to the $100 billion? How does eliminating all of that back office, particularly BTA and others, have you look me in the eye with a straight face and tell me you're just as committed to getting auditable financial management systems in place and audited financial statements for the Department of Defense as you were before this happened? Because it looks like you've taken the team that was on the field to do that and said they weren't going to get there. So my question is that the issue is, one, do you think telling the American people, the confidence of the taxpayers you mentioned earlier, Mr. Lynn, is helped or hurt by the Department of Defense having audited financial statements? In other words, is the department better able to look them in the eye and say, your money is being spent the way we think it's supposed to be spent, or just trust us? We don't need audits. We're the single largest entity in the face of the earth from a spending standpoint, and audits are needed or not needed. You can just trust us that we'll spend this money. So how do you defend the law that none of you will be here when it happens, that it's 2017 that's required to be for the Department of Defense to be audited? None of you guys will be here, and so we won't be able to hold your feet to the fire or have any kind of a penalty for you because you didn't get there. And so the passive aggressive, we'll just, we're going to get there, but it's going to be somebody else's job, is frustrating to me. And then to have you say, well, we really don't need the BTA. We don't need a focus on getting the financial statements audited. Can you help me understand how you're still going to keep it as a top priority for the department to get audited financial statements, and at the same time not commit resources to getting that done? Mike.
Yeah, thank you. There's a couple of questions embedded there. Let me, if I could just take the first one. You asked where the $100 billion came from. We were discussing that with Mr. McKeon. It was a calculation of what does it take to get our warfighting accounts to 2 to 3% real growth.
Well, I'll ask you to give me that math because I'm not following it, but go ahead.
Okay, I'm happy for the record to provide you how the math, but that is, we can provide you the calculation, but that is where the $100 billion came from. It wasn't a totaling of proposals. It was a target based on what we thought we needed to get warfighting accounts to 2 to 3%, which is what history tells you you need to continue continue upgrades, continue supporting training and personnel.
Okay.
The bulk of your question, though, was on audited financial statements.
And sustainable systems.
And sustainable. Well, that's where I was going, actually.
Okay.
The most important piece is not an audit, in my mind. The most important piece is the management information systems that the audit just provides a test of. Right. And we are committed to that. It is, as I'm sure you well understand, given your background, it is somewhat different than it is in the private sector. The goal here is not providing information to investors. The goal is ensuring the taxpayers' money is well spent, that the stewardship is there. For that reason, we have focused our initial efforts on upgrading management information systems that have to do with budgetary resources. That's we're trying to focus on the most important information because, as you indicated, this is a mammoth job, and so we want to start with the most important piece, and we are continuing to do that. The comptroller, who has the lead...
Mr. Hale and I have had this conversation. The focus on the data you use, and it's not getting there. You're not getting there, but go ahead.
Well, if we're not getting there, we probably ought to have a discussion, because that is indeed what we're trying, and I'm sure that's what Mr. Hale told you. And as you indicated, Mr. Hale has the lead for this. This is the comptroller's lead. The Business Transformation Agency plays a contributory role in terms of some of the business systems. It was the Secretary's conclusion, not that it would hinder audited financial statements, is that the BTA became an added layer when Congress added the position of Deputy Chief Management Officer, to which the BTA reports that there was no longer a need for a senior official. The DCMO is an undersecretary level official and a defense agency. So we're going to fold the responsibilities underneath the DCMO directly, and we think we're going to get some overhead savings by combining the senior official with the defense agency, and that was the conclusion. It was not a rolling back of our commitment to audited financial statements.
All right. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for your testimony. I think what Secretary Gates has to say is characteristically necessary, correct, and I want to be a supporter of his and his efforts to bring some rationality to this exploding budget. So I appreciate the work you're doing on his behalf, and I appreciate his position. A little unsolicited advice. As you've heard from Mr. Nye's concerns, Mr. Forbes' concerns, you'll hear from Mr. Scott. Anytime we make some kind of reduction or change in this budget, it is very difficult to do. You're living that every day. I think it's especially important to do so in a way that is procedurally defensible in every respect. The concern that I would express, having heard from my colleagues about this, about the Joint Forces Command, is, a decision announced August 9th, given the cycle of when the Congress considers appropriations bills, when it considers authorization bills, is unfortunate. I think when you're going to make decisions like this, you should follow either of two tracks. You should either do it in the budget presentation so the normal process can work its course, or you should call for another BRAC, and imperfect as that process is, I think it's gained some credibility. So the hard decisions that you have ahead of you, I think, will become more achievable if you follow some sort of regular order. Second thing I want to chime in on is what my friend from Texas, Mr. Conaway, just said. The legislation he and I worked on together that the committee unanimously approved, the floor nearly unanimously approved, which hopefully will be enacted as part of the authorization bill, does place great emphasis on these financial audits. And I think that you will gain credibility with the public and with the Congress when these audits are done. I think it will permit us to discover areas where we can, in fact, achieve efficiency without risking in any way, shape, or form the security of the country. I wanted to ask you your opinion on the following question. Any of the three of you would be fine. The Major Weapons Systems bill the President signed in May of 2009 was predicated on the premise that the GAO report that we had overspent by nearly $300 billion on, I think it was 17 major weapons systems. What do you think a plausible goal is in terms of reducing outlays in future major weapons systems? In other words, if we could unscramble the egg from the GAO report, in theory, it would have saved about $300 billion. What do you think we will gain in terms of avoiding cost overruns if we properly implement the waste TKO law the President signed in 2009?
It's hard to give you
Would the gentleman yield, sir?
Yes.
Just hold up, and you're going to get your remaining time. They have just announced a vote on a motion to adjourn. I am going to, it's the chair's intention to continue the hearing. So if those of you who need to go make that vote, do so, but we're going to continue the hearing. Thank you very much, Mr. Andrews. We'll give you back that half a minute or so.
Of course, Mr. Chairman.
It's hard to set a target other than that we should bring in the programs on cost and on budget. I don't know, you hate to set a target that I'm going to fail by so much. I think under Dr. Carter's leadership and with the committee's legislative assistance, I think we have put in place things that are going to allow us to do that. We are putting far more contracts under fixed price incentive terms rather than cost plus terms, which give a convergence of the incentives of both the contractor and the government now to bring it in at the price that was originally quoted, because we're now sharing the risk if we go over. Dr. Carter has introduced things that are making schedule a key performance parameter, because indeed it's loss of schedule that is one of the most common causes for cost overrun. So we want schedule, not just performance, to be important. We're trying to, happy for Dr. Carter if you'd like to expand on those, we're trying to put in place the things that will bring that GAO number down. The target is to bring it to no cost overruns. I understand that I'm not naive. That's a very ambitious goal, but that is the goal.
Dr. Carter, would you like to comment?
Just to echo what the deputy said, and it's an edifice we build brick by brick. I'll give you a few examples of recent bricks. Joint Strike Fighter Program, which we had to tell you last fall was an aircraft that in 2002 we had told you would be $50 million per aircraft in $02. and that our current estimate, which was a credible estimate, so-called will cost estimate, was $92 million per aircraft. And I think Secretary Gates, Deputy Secretary Lynn, and I look at that number and say, no, we're not going to pay that. We shouldn't have. Let's see what we can do to get that number down. We're working with the performers of the work to do that. We're making some progress in that regard, and just in that regard, as a result of that progress, I think the services have been able to reallocate from money they thought they might have to spend on Joint Strike Fighter over the next 5 years, some $580 million, which is a contribution to that $100 billion. Another example.
It's a good start, yep.
Another example, the FA-18 multi-year on a $6 billion contract, now about $5.3 billion, because you allowed us to procure those aircraft on a multi-year basis, $600 million over the FIDIP that will not have to be spent and can be reallocated from that, essentially the overhead at the plants that make the FA-18, as a consequence of them not being able to plan on a multi-year basis. That overhead can be plowed into warfighting accounts, just exactly the principle that Secretary Lynn has been talking about, and Secretary Gates.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I want to jump right in, since my time is limited, and talk about the decision-making between the recommendation to close Joint Forces Command. First of all, I think there's a tremendous lack of transparency there. It took us over 7 weeks to get a response back from the Secretary. Ranking Member Forbes, Ranking Member McKeon, and myself requested that, and when we got the letter back, it just restated the initial decision and had in there a justification as to why this didn't fall under BRAC. And I noticed using the term disestablish GIFCOM rather than close GIFCOM, a noted parsing of terms. Seems like to me that as we look at this process, first of all, we were told, well, this is an efficiency effort. We're going to be looking at this to look at where we can attain efficiencies. But we're told that there was no efficiency analysis or cost analysis about closing GIFCOM. That's yet to come. And then we were said, well, really, it wasn't a business decision. It was really a military decision. So when we ask, well, tell us the strategic analysis behind that, we're told, well, we're in the process of doing it. We have some operational documents out there that talk about how jointness is going to be continued, but strategically we haven't figured out who's going to do this job, how it's going to be done. So none of those details have been put together. And then we said, well, let us understand a little bit then about the process. And you said, well, we had over 30 meetings. And we said, well, it'd be nice to know what happened in those 30 meetings. It's amazing to me how 30 meetings can take place at the Pentagon. There isn't a single note, there isn't a single proceedings anywhere about those meetings that you can divulge to us. Boy, I'll tell you, I'd love to know a little bit more about how those meetings take place there and how you can have no proceedings there, nothing that we can get our hands on to understand what goes on there. So you can understand why we're a little bit frustrated by the lack of transparency, the lack of understanding about a decision of this magnitude. And as the chairman so rightfully pointed out, the effort that it went into providing a framework for jointness. And a decision of this magnitude, without the transparency, without this body understanding, and Secretary Lynn, you lectured us on the responsibilities of a leader. I would say that your responsibility as a leader is to provide that information so that we as a Congress can do our duty, and our duty to the people that have elected us to make sure we understand the decisions, understand the implications to this nation of those decisions. So I appreciate that lecture. I would say that the responsibility cuts both ways, and that the Pentagon also has a responsibility back to the Congress to divulge back to us clearly how that decision was made, what the underlying information is there. And my question boils down to this. It seems like this process is wrought with inconsistencies, is wrought with lack of information being disclosed to us. Even at one point when a meeting was had, Christine Fox said that this was a philosophical decision. So we're going from it's an efficiency effort, no, it's a military decision, no, it's a philosophical decision, without any transparency to understand exactly what's going on. And my question is this: I want to know historically about how these decisions are made. Can you tell me other instances where decisions are made of this magnitude where you do the analysis afterwards, where you do a post-decision analysis instead of a pre-decision analysis. Can you tell me when that focus has been in the past on saying we'll do the analysis after we make a decision or after we make a recommendation?
Mr. Whitman, I appreciate the fact that you and other members of the delegation feel that we should have gotten you more information, we should have gotten it to you faster. So I discussed with Congressman Nye going forward. We've met with the governor yesterday morning with yourself and some of the other members. We will ensure, as I discussed, that the governor and those same members get the opportunity to meet directly with the Secretary. We'll seek your input.
Secretary Lynn, with all due respect, that's not the question I asked. The question I asked was, can you tell me when in the past decisions have been made like this with the lack of analysis prior to the decision and without that being able to be divulged?
I was addressing some of the preamble that you had before that, but let me jump to your question. The Secretary made his decision with enormous input from the military and the civilian advisors that he had. As we've discussed, his reasoning here was on what is the military purpose for this command and is it still valid today? The conclusion he came to, based on the advice he received, was no, the purpose had been served in some cases, could be accomplished by other organizations in other cases, and was duplicative in cases such as force provisioning, and the Joint Forces Command wasn't needed in that role. For those reasons, and he received a lot of input to that decision from his advisors in the meetings that you correctly summarized, he made his decision. As we've discussed with other members of the committee, once he's made that decision, the question then is how much of the $1 billion would be saved, and that's a decision by what would be retained and what would not. We are not going to eliminate every component of the Joint Forces Command, nor are we going to keep every component. We're going to go through a thorough analysis, which we will share with you, as I discussed with Congressman Nye, as to what needs to be kept and what needs to go. At the end of that process, we'll have the complete case that you desire.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized. Ms. Davis, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your all being here. This is difficult, very difficult, and I certainly understand the concerns of my colleagues. I wanted to shift for a second in the more personnel health care arena, because we're talking about jointness on the one hand, and in the House Defense Authorization, there is a provision that would create a permissive authority to establish a unified medical command. Given that the Center for Naval Analysis predicts that such a move would save approximately $294 million a year, we actually were surprised that the departments opposed strongly that section of the bill. And it's also true, of course, that I don't think any of the political appointee positions have been filled within health affairs. So I'm just wondering what objection the Unified Medical Command you have and that you've encountered. What is the, I think, considerable pushback to reject the House proposal that we think would save significant savings?
This is, as Congressman knows, this is a long-running debate over a command versus an agency and how we treat our health care. I actually think that we ought to, as the Secretary's indicated, a completely open mind. That second track I indicated was outside input. I think we should consider all possibilities as we look at overhead savings. So although we have had questions about it in the past, I would assert to you that we should take a look in the new fiscal circumstances we face. We should look anew at that proposal.
Is there any sense, can you give us any idea what kind of management structure, in fact, you might be thinking about? What that would be quite different from what we have today?
We don't have, I don't have any proposals to discuss in terms of changing the military, the medical management structure for the department at this point.
Okay. I think that a lot of issues have been raised about other commands or other installations that you might be thinking about closing. Is there anything else that you might share with us of other commands at this point?
I think the Secretary has said as part of his direction to the services that if they think there needs to be changes in installations, they should suggest that in their submissions, but we have not gotten to the point that we would request a BRAC. That would be just input. So we're not to a point of looking at closing bases or installations at this point.
Okay, thank you. Let me just turn then to an important personnel issue, and that affects the men and women across our country and certainly across the globe. And recognizing the strides that have been made in NWR and certainly in family support assistance programs and military one-source, as we're looking to efficiencies, what would you say, how would you articulate the efficiencies in family policy that are being envisioned right now, and how are these efficiency studies going to impact our policies as it relates to the men and women and their families that are serving today?
I think the Secretary would be interested in any proposals where we could deliver the same services to our military families in a more efficient way. I do not think he would look favorably on proposals that would reduce the support to families at this point. It's not quite part of the direct warfighting, but I think the Secretary believes it's equally important, and that would not be, I think, the avenue that the Secretary is looking to go down. He's more interested in the things, frankly, we've been discussing: delayering, eliminating headquarters, reducing bureaucracy. I think in terms of benefits for military families, that's not the direction he's looking to in terms of making shifts in resources.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that, because as you know, we really are in uncharted territories as our men and women return, and I don't think we really have quite got our heads around what that's going to mean. I appreciate it. And very, very, very quickly, I mean, people have raised the issues of insourcing, outsourcing, and I think one of the things that I'm hearing out in the San Diego community is a concern from businesses that a number of their positions and their people, highly qualified people, they use the word poaching, that the military is essentially finding them. It's not that hard to find them, and bringing them in, and they think that this could create an imbalance down the road. I just want to express that to you, that that's being heard, and wonder if you have any comment.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman.
I guess not.
10 seconds.
No, we do hear reports from the field. We need to follow up and make sure that all the steps that are taken are appropriate, and that the government isn't doing anything appropriate in seeking the goals of getting more expertise into the government. That's certainly not the objective of the insourcing program.
Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lynn, Secretary Carter, and General Cartwright, thank you so much for your service to our country and your testimony today. I certainly respect the comments of Congressman Randy Forbes from Virginia in terms of the process, and that maybe it wasn't the best process that you used in arriving at your conclusion. But I want to say this, as somebody who served in both the United States Army and the United States Marine Corps, and served in both the first Gulf War and the Iraq War, and that the 15 intervening years between 1990 and 2005, between my service in the first Gulf War and the Iraq War, there has just been a quantum leap in terms of jointness in our military. And I think that it is something that today is ingrained in our military culture. So I think that you are right to evaluate whether or not we still need the Joint Forces Command in light of the extraordinary changes in progress that our military has made. Let me go to a couple other issues. First of all, on the insourcing, outsourcing issue. It seems that Republican administrations want to outsource and Democrat administrations want to insource. And let me just say that maybe there's a compromise between the two, and that's effectively managing contracts and I'm not sure that we're doing that right now, and I think we need to do a better job before we make a decision about insourcing and effectively managing the contracts that we have. And just a couple more quick issues, and then love your response. I think that one area that we could actually derive a savings and increase the effectiveness in our military, and it is not certainly a subject of our discussions yet today, is the fact that I think that our personnel system in terms of promotion is too rapid. And I think that our members of our military are not getting enough experience in their respective time and grades. And I think that we would improve our warfighting skills and save in the operating budget if we would, in fact, slow this promotion process down. And with that, I would defer to any of you for comments.
Let me, on the issue of managing service contracts, we in fact agree with you, and a significant part of Secretary Carter's initiative earlier this month was improvements in that regard, and let me ask him to describe those for you.
There are a number of those that have to do with improving our tradecraft, getting a better deal, better value for the $200 billion we spend on services. But specifically to the insourcing question raised just twice, couple points. The first is that, yes, it has gone back and forth from time to time. I think the important thing to bear in mind is one size doesn't fit all. Some things it is beneficial to outsource. Mowing the lawn at the base. Why should the base commander have to figure out how to get the lawn mowed? There are people who do that for a living, and it's much more efficient to do that. When it comes to contracting officers, pricers, systems engineers in a systems command, you really want to have in the government people who have those skills. And what lay behind the Secretary of Defense's insourcing initiative for the acquisition workforce, which is ongoing and which he has indicated is not being curtailed because of the efficiencies initiative, was less to save money, though on average it can be the case that a government employee fully loaded costs less than a contractor. The point was to get within our walls and on our side of the table the talent that we need responsibly to spend $400 billion in contracted goods and services that we do every year. So are we poaching? I mean, we do go to the open market and ask people to come and join the ranks of government. They come from some other job. I'm delighted when they do come. I'll tell you, I talk to these people, and what we have on our side when we recruit is the mission. We don't have money, we don't pay a lot, our buildings aren't steel and glass, you know, they're wood and old and so forth, but we have the mission, and that's particularly for young people what really gets them hooked, is the idea that they're going to be contributing to national security.
Let me just interrupt one point, but you also have a personnel system that rewards mediocrity in the sense that it takes an act of God to fire somebody, and that definitely needs to be reformed.
I agree with you, and that, in fact, is something that Secretary Gates emphasizes all the time, and another thing that we are trying to address in the course of the Workforce Initiative.
The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today. Dr. Carter, in your testimony, I mean, I think you sort of framed the fact that, you know, just setting aside all these percentage numbers, increase, decrease, I mean, the fact is we still have to deal with the challenge of the alternative of broken or canceled programs or ones that work. And I think really that really should be the outcome that we're all trying to together achieve. And in the short time that I've been here, I mean, seeing the presidential helicopter and the Zumwalt destroyer program just sort of collapse under their own weight. You know, that's not a rhetorical point that you were making in your testimony. You know, the program that we've been keeping an eye on over the last year or so is the SSBN program, which, as you point out, has been endorsed by the QDR, Nuclear Posture Review, and was included in the 30-year shipbuilding program. But there was no question that the price tag, which the Navy was, you know, assuming was one that was going to potentially challenge the surface ships of our Navy. And again, it appears from your testimony that already just within the last few months, I mean, there's been some progress made in terms of that milestone A cost reduction. You know, I guess the question is, you know, that reduction has nothing to do with the fact that this administration is still committed to moving forward with SSBN, which I appreciate if you could address that point. And secondly, that the capability that has been identified in terms of that program and our national security need for a sea-based deterrent also is not being compromised. It's really about trying to, again, not end up with another Zumwalt program that 10 years, 20 years down the road is going to be unsustainable and really affect our ability to defend ourselves as a nation. So I was wondering if you could address that point.
I think that's accurate. It's more a question of how than whether. On the other hand, if you don't get the how right, you can get the weather wrong, if you're following me. And the helicopter was an example of that. And so we don't want to get ourselves in a situation with SSBNX where we design a submarine that we know we won't be able to afford. And the Navy has done, I think, an excellent job in the last several months of going through all the design drivers for SSBNX and looking at where the change in one of the design features or one of the requirements that drives the design features can be changed in such a way that the cost of the submarine is reduced without sacrificing in any way essential military capabilities. And this kind of disciplined systems engineering job really does work. They have managed to reduce the estimated cost of that submarine by 16% already, and it is very plausible that they'll get down to the 27%, which is the target. And if you consider that this is a project that's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 20 years, if you're talking 16%, $27 billion in cost you won't have to pay, that's a significant engineering achievement, and it will bring the submarine in at a price that the country will afford. It won't be one of these programs that collapses of its own weight.
And the timing of that milestone, given the fact that the design work is really just sort of commencing at this point, I mean, really is consistent with all the acquisition reform models that this committee endorsed, which is to not get ourselves into a position of design build at the same time and wasting money. And Again, I think what you've described is something that fits well within the schedule that your budget is embarking on. And as you said, I mean, long term, that's going to create some relief for the budget, for the defense budget, without sacrificing any of our country's deterrence, which again is something that is, I think, again, has been embraced by this administration. I mean, again, there's no compromise that's being made in as far as this initiative regarding those goals which were set forth in the NPR and the QDR. I mean, that's, I just want to at least underscore and emphasize that.
Absolutely, it's consistent both with the NPR and QDR and very much with the intent of the work of this committee in the area of acquisition reform, particularly at the beginning of the program life cycle.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, this is an important issue, which is why many of us are staying here a little bit longer. I want to go into another area of weeds, if I could, for just a moment. First of all, General Cartwright, thank you for being in Utah recently. The wife of my legislative director, thanks you very much for her purse, and we'll just leave that issue right there. Mr. Carter, if I can talk to you, though, specifically about it, I've been appreciative in the past of your understanding of industrial base issues, especially as we talked about solid rocket motors, when other agencies outside of the Department of Defense and in the White House were clueless about the entire issue. I want to address, because I'm concerned, especially when we're talking about a $100 billion cut when recapitalization is yet to be completed. Concerned about another industrial base, and this one, the small turbine engines. The weapon of choice that we have is basically the cruise missile, Tomahawk, tactical Tomahawk, air-launched cruise missile. We have those because the industrial base produces them at a low cost with a very high efficient small turbine engine. Yet one of the proposals to cut the Tomahawk procurement and to zero out R&D on the supersonic cruise missile definitely puts that private sector in danger of maintaining that industrial base and losing the expertise we have to keep those programs functional. So the three questions I do have specifically for you. Is the small defense turbofan industrial base something that your office has specifically identified as a defense industrial base concern? Secondly, what can we expect to see from your office or DOD in the way of specific actions to address an industrial base concern if it indeed has been identified as such? And finally, with Russia and India announcing sometime back that they are jointly fielding a supersonic cruise missile, is it wise for this administration to pull back R&D at this particular time? And is that, once again, something that was a specific point of discussion in making your decisions on zeroing out the R&D on the supersonic cruise missile, as well as cutbacks in procurement of Tomahawk?
Thank you, Congressman. I think I can answer all three of those questions. Certainly, to the first question, emphatically, yes, I'm aware of the issue that the end of TACTOM production occasions. We have specifically identified it as an industrial base issue. And I should say industrial base issues are, as you noted, very important. Deputy Secretary Lynn has identified that as an area of great importance to the department and expects us to pay attention to it, and we are. I don't know the actions that will come out of that review yet.
Secretary Carter, let me, for interest of time, just direct you here. If you could write what the actions will be submitted to us later on, that would be fine.
Will do.
If, though, you could answer the question on, the Russian and Indian activity, was that a part of the consideration? Did you discuss that before making this decision?
Yes, I mean, not those specific programs, but the global situation and the investments that we will need to make in standoff weapons. We know we will need to make investments in standoff weapons. They're being considered as part of the long-range strike family of systems work that's going on. They may well result in other kinds of new standoff weapons programs, and it's for that reason. It's to protect that option that the industrial base is so important, so that if we do choose that option again in the future, we'll have the industrial capability to produce the engines.
Thank you. I appreciate your concern for that in base. Too many people have the naive idea these bases can be just turned on and off like a spigot. Congressman Taylor, thank you for allowing me to get that question, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, we recently had a classified briefing on the roller situation in Afghanistan and the need to deploy them in a more expedient manner. One of the things that came to light, and I'm trying to stay within the confines of the classified nature of that, was that the Sparks II roller is made overseas, and that the date for all of them being delivered is several months off. One of the things that is delaying the arrival of all of them is that in the purchase of this, we did not get the technical data package. I would hope that one of the revisions that your organization is looking into making is that any time our nation pays to develop a weapon, that is a part of that contract, that we will own the technical data package for that product, and that if we feel like a supplier is taking too long to deliver that product, then we, as a nation, will have the right to take that technical data package to another supplier, if need be, in order to get that program delivered in a more timely manner. I don't think, as a citizen, any citizen of this country wants to see a single soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine lose their life or limb needlessly because we're waiting on someone who has exclusive rights to that information to take too long to deliver it. I would welcome any of the secretaries or the general's thoughts on that, but most of all, I want to hear your reassurance that going forward, that anytime we're spending the nation's money to develop a product, that we're going to own the technical data package to that product that we pay to have delivered. Secretary Carter?
If I may, I'm very aware of the Sparks roller issue. They are being destroyed at a rate larger than we had anticipated.
And for the sake of the public, the good news is when the roller is destroyed, the vehicle behind it is not.
That's exactly right.
But the bad news is then we have to get another roller to theater in a hurry.
That's exactly right. And I agree with you about technical data package. You and I have discussed that in the context of the littoral combat ship competition, and I'll just note that in the spirit of amen to what you said, that in the document that I issued 2 weeks ago, that of the 23 items in that, one is specifically to improve the way that we acquire technical data packages. We need to learn what our rights are in that regard, and also how to value them so that they can be we can carry out the transaction, appropriate transaction with industry. So I agree with you completely.
Okay. With that, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Nye. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you yielding time to me earlier. I just wanted to follow up with a couple of thoughts and questions. Secretary Lynn, you heard from a number of members of the committee today the notion that this process is hard. The process of finding savings to reallocate within the Defense Department is a challenging one, but that having the committee involved and using the regular 2012 budgeting process is probably the best route to do that. Now, what I wanted to ask you was, and I know that the Secretary has said most of the decision-making he intends to be done during that process, and I think you've backed that up today. I'm curious to know if you can shed any light on why Secretary Gates decided August 9th was the right time to sort of pre-announce a certain segment of those decision-making, and not to, noting the fact that we've had some discussion today about the fact that an analysis of Joint Forces Command, for example, of how this could and would be done and what the options would end up being has yet to be done. Why August 9th? Why not wait and just do this as part of the regular process?
I think Secretary Gates felt a strong need to jumpstart the process, to establish that this was going to be an aggressive process, that this was going to be a process that he was going to be involved in personally, and that he wanted to start by establishing what he's called a culture of savings. And in particular, he focused on the areas of headquarters, of staffing, general officers, senior executives, redundancy, extra layers, and he wanted to take steps that were really more management steps that he could take immediately to try and establish the path ahead so that as we go forward with the budget, the rest of the building would follow on and be equally aggressive.
Okay. Well, again, I just want to encourage you in the strongest possible terms to do this process within the regular established order. I think you will find that your ability to work with the Congress on it will be greatly enhanced if we have an opportunity to be part of that process. I want to say, and again, recognize that you have said today you intend to include us in that analysis process before any decisions are implemented. Thank you for that. I also want to note that General Cartwright has said today that during that analysis, at this point, all options are still on the table, and essentially the status quo is one possible option for the outcome of that analysis, one possible option. We may reach another conclusion, but that is still on the table as a possible outcome, and I appreciate the fact that we'll be allowed to be involved in the analysis and in the process going forward. One last thing I want to make in terms of comments, and I want to follow up on something that Mr. Whitman asked about. He asked you, can you give us an example of when a decision was made without an analysis which we agree needs to be done, you know, sort of the cart before the horse idea. I can tell you, I can think of one, and that has to do with the recommendation to build a 5th U.S. carrier home port in Mayport without the analysis done to support that decision. Now, I say this just to say, for the record, given the fact that we're going through a difficult decision-making process of how to save money, cut down on overhead, and reallocate it within the Defense Department, I will be very surprised and dismayed if during this 2012 budget process that we have coming up, the Defense Department, again, having stated that we've got to find savings in overhead, especially things that are redundant and duplicative, asks for money to build a $1 billion port facility in Mayport that is by its very nature duplicative and redundant. I don't need an answer from you on that. I just wanted to state that for the record. Again, this is a tough process. I recognize that y'all have very difficult work to do here, and so do we. And I appreciate the fact that you've recognized that today. To be honest with you, I think that recognition was late in coming, but I'm happy to note that you have agreed that we should be part of that process going forward. I look forward to working with you in taking a very good business case, if you want to use that word, military look, but an analysis of the best decision-making that we can make going forward on the contractor issue on Joint Forces Command and all the other efficiency questions that we have to solve together. Again, I thank you for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlemen, yield. You have a few seconds left.
Yes,
18 to be exact.
I just want to clarify what the gentleman is indicated in his statement and his earlier statement, to reiterate or to confirm. What I hear him saying is that you've committed to involve the Congress in the decision to disband or to eliminate JEFCOM, or are you agreeing that you're just going to, you've already made the decision, you will make the decision, the Secretary will make the decision, the President will make the decision, and then you'll include us in how you carry out that decision?
The Secretary has made his recommendation to the President on disestablishing Joint Forces Command. The President has not yet made his decision, and I've committed here with Congressman Nye and others that as we move forward on the implementation of that decision, should the President affirm it, we will work with the committee and the Congress in making those implementation decisions.
Okay, it just sounds like I hear you're saying maybe he misunderstood, or maybe he thought that you were going to involve the Congress in the decision making, but rather that's already done, and it's just now the implementation.
I think I'd end up saying again what I just said.
I want to make sure that
you'd like to say it again.
Thank you.
For the benefit of the committee, they have just called a vote on the adjournment resolution. So it is the chair's intention to keep this going for another 10 minutes. That will be followed by 2 5-minute votes. That will make the hearing approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes. So having said that, in the 10 minutes that remain, the chair intends to recognize Mr. Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. Secretary Lynn, I share the concerns of Congressman Forbes. Thus far, your testimony is that the Joint Forces Command decision was made as a result of several ad hoc discussions among senior DOD officials. I know these officials have reviewed some documents that outline their military rationale for the decision. Knowing that there's been documentation considered, I request those documents, print and electronic, used as a basis for the military decisions to be provided to the committee. Additionally, my question is to Secretary Carter. The National Guard and Reserve forces have been instrumental in the global war on terrorism, and I know firsthand of how successful and capable Guard and Reserve are. I served in both for 31 years, and I have 4 sons currently serving in the military, 3 in the National Guard. However, Guard and Reserve still faces shortages of proper equipment for training and for use in theater. How are the proposed acquisition reforms going to affect the Guard and Reserve?
The piece of the efficiency initiative that I was describing will affect the procurement of equipment irrespective of the ultimate customer, but I think the burden of your question about equipage of the Guard and Reserve in the future would be better answered by General Cartwright than by me.
General, thank you.
As we work through these efficiency activities, the intent is to get to a better ratio of what we're calling tooth to tail, but to get those forces that are standing in order to go support either the global war on terrorism or any other activities that may be identified either on the federal side or on the state side. The question is, can we afford, through the efficiencies, to get sufficient equipment to outfit everybody with the best capabilities that we have? Or are we going to do that in some other way? In other words, are there going to be shortages that we're going to have to manage, and if so, how we have managed them? The idea here is to generate the resources so that we don't have those shortages.
Great, and you personally, I want to thank the Marine Corps. I represent Parris Island, Marine Corps Air Station, Beaufort Naval Hospital. I'm very proud of the Marines. At this time, I yield the balance of my time to Congressman Forbes of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Secretary, would you agree to provide to the chairman and the ranking member a copy of the non-disclosure agreement that you've required people at Joint Forces Command to sign?
I'm not directly familiar with those non-disclosure
if there is
agreements,
one, would
but
you
I
provide?
will explore whether there is one, and if I'll report my findings to the chairman and ranking member.
And if there is one, will you give them a copy?
Yes.
Can you tell us, is it your testimony today that you've provided to this committee all of the written analysis that was given to the Secretary of Defense to make his decision to close the Joint Forces Command?
We have provided the committee.
Just need to know, yes or no, all the written information. If you have, yes. If you haven't, no.
We have provided all the committee the analysis, the rationale.
Secretary, I don't have much. I'm just asking, have you provided all the written analysis that was given to the Secretary of Defense to this committee? If you haven't, it's okay. I just need to know.
I'm going to have to, you're going to have to let me answer. We have provided the committee a body of material that supports what the Secretary
That's not my
decided.
question, Mr. Secretary. In all due respect, I'm asking, have you provided this committee with all of the written analysis that was provided to the Secretary of Defense to make the decision to close the Joint Forces Command? Yes or no? It's pretty simple.
We have provided the committee with the material that supports the decision that the Secretary made.
I'm asking if you've provided the written material that was given to the Secretary, all the material that was given to the Secretary for the Secretary to make his decision.
I've answered the question.
No, you haven't. You've said you provided analysis, but that could have been backfilled analysis. I'm asking, have we gotten all the written documentation that was provided to the Secretary?
The Secretary has provided you the material that
he thinks
supports,
we should have?
That supports his decision. I will go back and see if there is more material that we can provide you.
So what you're saying is you don't know, as you're sitting there, whether there was more written information given to him or not.
I'm saying that I'll explore as to whether there's more material that we can provide you to
Do you
try and
know
help
if
you
there
with
was
this
any more
decision.
written material, Mr. Secretary, as you're sitting there testifying?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'm saying, do you know whether there was more written material given to the Secretary than was provided to this amendment?
I am saying that we provided you with a body of material.
Secretary, my time's
supports
out, and you're not going to answer the question, just like you haven't provided us with the information, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman. The gentlewoman from Guam, Ms. Badallo. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Lynn, it's good to see you again. Secretary Carter and General Cartwright. Let me divert slightly from the topic of today's hearing and bring up concerns about the military buildup in Guam, and they certainly are issues of cost efficiencies if we get the buildup done right. The record of decision was signed by Assistant Secretary of the Navy Jackie Pfannenstiel, and while the ROD delays a final decision on the location of a firing range, it states a preference to acquire land on the east side of the island on a bluff above the Pagat Historical and Cultural Site. I remain extremely skeptical that such a land acquisition deal can be struck with the government of Guam. So with that in mind, can you outline what steps the department is taking in regards to meet Marine Corps training requirements? Has the department considered Tinian Island or some of the DOD land on Guam that could be used? And again, I want to repeat, I'm skeptical that a deal can be struck and I would not feel it prudent for the department to spend billions of dollars without a deal secured for the training range. So can you please comment, and can I get your commitment to more seriously explore alternatives for the Marine Corps firing range? Secretary Lynn.
Congressman Bordillo, thank you for the question. I appreciate the questions. You know, I recently visited Guam and saw for myself the plans and the issues that we face. The training range is a critical issue. I agree with you. To have the Marines move to Guam and to maintain the levels of training that we would expect out of a Marine unit, we do need to find some resolution of this issue. I think you've correctly described it. Paget, that location in Paget is the preferred location. That was after analyzing government land and some other options. Tinian is off-island, probably appropriate for some training, but not close enough for the small arms training we're talking about here. We're much more interested in a training range on Guam. We are continuing to understand the cultural concerns in the Chamorro site that's there. We are continuing to work those issues, and we are hoping that we can find a resolution that allows the Marines to conduct their training on Guam without compromising the cultural site. And we're going to continue to work with you on that, and I agree it's a critical issue for going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I do want to get it on record to state that you are seriously looking at alternatives. I have another question. General Cartwright, I guess I'm following up on Congressman Wilson's question. The recommendation put forth are a good start on some of these to maximum efficiencies. But as I reviewed the recommendations, I'm perplexed as to why the department has not tackled personnel costs. And what further frustrates me is that I don't see anywhere where the National Guard plays a role in the solutions. And this is a frustration of mine with regards to the buildup in Guam and now here. The Guard has demonstrated that it can recruit and retain quality soldiers and airmen at a significant savings over the active duty personnel. So can I get a commitment to more adequately review this potential efficiency?
I think your reference here is the more frequent use of the Guard in lieu
That's
of
correct.
the active force, and ensuring that they are well equipped as they go forward and well trained and afforded the opportunities to be well equipped.
And there will be savings.
The Guard in itself will generate savings. This effort will generate savings to equip the Guard and continue to keep the Guard trained at the levels that we have become accustomed to, which is substantially higher than anything we've experienced in the past. So our commitment here is to generate this savings so that we can plow it back into that tooth, which we consider the Guard to be. How much we get here, and then our work with the Congress will determine the amount of money that's available to do that. I acknowledge the fact that there are savings that we reap from utilizing the Guard that we don't necessarily receive utilizing active forces. But there are trades that we make there in that area also, operationally.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentlewoman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for, if you could keep it very brief, Mr. Scott, we have only 3 minutes remaining on the vote across the street.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to get a couple of things quickly on the record. Secretary Lynn, it's, on the QDR, there was no recommendation to close JEFCOM, is that right?
That's correct. It didn't address command issues.
There was no recommendation to close JEFCOM. And during the last BRAC, JEFCOM was mentioned, but the decision was made not to close JEFCOM. Is that right?
Yes.
And it was mentioned in BRAC, which suggests that BRAC has jurisdiction, which is an interesting little thing. In reference to in your answer to my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Forbes, you said you have given information that supports the decision. That invites the inquiry whether there are documents that did not support the decision that are floating around. Do such documents exist?
Not to my knowledge.
No document exists that gave an evaluation that suggested that maybe it shouldn't be closed. There was no written debate about this.
Mr. Scott, I hate to do this to you, but we are at the 2-minute mark. Could I ask you to please submit
Well,
the remainder of your questions for the
If I
record?
can just get a quick answer to that, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to just get in a couple of questions.
Well, if you would, if the gentleman is going to submit the remainder of his questions for the record.
Fine.
And General Cartwright, Chairman Skelton also has some questions for you for the record. And with that, I do want to thank all three of you gentlemen for being here. The meeting stands adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.